All right, everyone. So now for an overview of week three, market society, another one of these foundational uh, weeks of content. So this is something that we will continue to address throughout the semester, um, because if nothing else, our society is really dominated by economic markets. That's just the reality, for better or worse. And so it's important that we understand the implications of that system and sort of some of the fundamental beliefs of the market-based system on sustainability. There are a couple of cartoons here. Suggest you maybe give them some thought. I find them kind of funny, but it's like any geeky sustainability kind of way. All right, so market society. Uh, there's a short reading here that I put together about the name, the market society. It actually comes from this sort of seminal work from the 1940s, Carl Polanyi. Um, And basically, the idea here is that we've reached a point in society, and we had at that point, that the market is just so dominant in society and dictates so many of the decisions from a societal and political level, and actually an individual level, that he called it the market society. And so I've provided a little overview of what the market is, in case you're not familiar with it, if you haven't had econ or any kind of exposure to it. The market is really this system of exchanging goods for money, goods and services for money, right? So you think of the market, the free market, all those terms, they refer to this economic market that we find ourselves in. Another really important term here is neoliberal economics, which is this sort of, if you're familiar with the term laissez-faire economics, free market, quote unquote, free markets, and I put those in quotation marks for a reason. So, but this free market system that we have, that whole philosophy is relatively new. A little over 100 years old. This belief in this free market system, and that the term for that is neoliberal economics. And in this case, liberal is not politically liberal, liberal meaning free, as in free markets. Okay. So this is this dominant economic paradigm that we find ourselves in. There is some pushback against this. We can talk about that, and I think some of it has a lot of merit. But to be really clear, this system, for all of the failures that we'll talk about, especially from a sustainability perspective, for all of its failures, it's actually a pretty amazing system, because it kind of just, for the most part, just happens. And it's a really pretty good way of finding a cheap, I guess, like finding a way for when you have limited resources, limited physical resources or any kind of resource, and sort of pricing them out. It does a pretty interesting job, and it served us pretty well. You can look at a lot of things around us, all of these modern conveniences we have, especially modern medicine. Like a lot of that is market based. Now, a lot of that is not market based because a lot of it is based on government subsidies, government R&D, especially in terms of the medical field. The government, up until recently, has funded a lot of this research and development for new drugs and new techniques, cancer, things to fight cancer and other diseases and so forth. And so I just want to kind of lay that out there, that even though there are some genuine, well-deserved criticisms of this system, it is not all bad. And I'm not here to say that it is bad, capital B, period. But there are some things that we should be concerned about, in terms of what this market system has wrought. And we'll dive into a couple of those in this lesson. So the first subtopic is externalities. Really, really, really important concept to understand. So make sure you understand this. We'll talk about this in class. Externalities are, there's a couple different ways. So this is where it gets a little tricky because some people define them slightly differently. In a fundamental sense, an externality is an impact of a transaction that occurs to someone else. So if I buy, say, whatever, a cell phone, right? So I have this cell phone. I bought the cell phone. I paid a price for it, and in this case, this is Apple. They got money from me. The store got money from me, right? So that they're all part of the transaction. But if you think about where this good was produced, was there any pollution that resulted from it? Did that pollution cause anybody to get sick? Were they built under people weren't paid fair wages and so forth? So all of those aspects of the transaction that I undertook when I purchased this phone, um, they're not included in that transaction, but they were nonetheless impacted. Those are externalities, all of them. Those are negative externalities and negative impacts. Positive impacts, sometimes there are positive impacts, like building roads, for example. There are some negative impacts to building roads, but when after the road is built, that helps facilitate people traveling. If I want to take my family on a vacation, I have this highway system where I can get from A to B faster than if it was like these old small roads. And so that's actually a positive externality because I didn't make the choice to build the road, but I nonetheless am benefiting from it. Education is a really good example. All of us getting educated here, we are going to make society a better place, right? We just are by virtue of taking this class. And so that is a positive impact, hopefully, that comes from you, um, engaging in this transaction with the university, or excuse me, the with Delaware Tech. Um, and so you paid for the education, or you got some help or whatever, and then Delaware Tech benefits from it directly. But there's all these extra positive impacts that happen when we have more educated people. So there's positive and negative externalities. They're just so absolutely fundamentally important to understanding where a lot of our sustainability problems come from. And if we can talk about this in class, but one of the biggest and most important negative externalities of our modern system is climate change. So climate change is this result of all of these various economic transactions that aren't including the price of emitting that CO2 into the atmosphere. And then now we have this climate change issue, which the people that are largely getting impacted by climate change are not the ones that, for the most part, emitted a lot of the emissions that are causing it. So there's a lot to this. Um, the other definition of externality, which is one that we'll kind of focus on in this class, is if there's an impact of a transaction, an economic transaction, that's not included in the price of that transaction. All right, so if I drove my car to work, I emitted some greenhouse gases out of my tailpipe, and that contributed, however small, to climate change. And so that impact of climate change is not included in the price of the gas that I paid. And so that's a negative externality, right? It's not included in the price. And so hypothetically, if you could include all of the impacts in a price, which can be really difficult to do, but if they were, and the people that were impacted were all sort of given market wages or market payment, then some people would say it's not an externality. All right, so these are all really important to consider. And then we'll talk about neoliberal economics, kind of dig into some of the people that were some of the most important sort of players in this field of economics, going all the way back to Adam Smith in 1776. Have you ever heard of the invisible hand or the wealth of nations? That's free market economics. And then we'll look at a couple other folks like Milton Friedman, who is a more modern person, um, and then Julian Simon is even more modern. So all of these are people that I think do a pretty good job of explaining this neoliberal philosophy. But then we'll dig into more externalities in a little more detail, and then we'll talk about, we'll look at a case study of an externality, and then market failure. So market failure is basically when there are externalities, that's market failure. So market failure is when all of the costs of a transaction are not included in the price. So it's an externality, right? So externalities um, they are market failure. And so even the most staunch proponents of neoliberal economics, like Milton Friedman, recognizes that there are market failures out there. So, market failures are really important sustainability consideration. Then we'll look at a very, very, very famous, article. You don't have to read the whole thing. You're welcome to, and I encourage you to read it, but at least read these couple of pages. Something called The Tragedy of the Commons. which we'll talk about in more detail in class. But this is a really helpful way to think about, especially externalized costs. But also, there's this sort of perverse incentive to overuse resources. Really important article all the way back in the 1960s, I think. Yeah, 1968. And then we'll finally look, because again, we do like to look at some solutions, not just illustrate and describe problems, but look at some solutions. So, what are some of the solutions to the tragedy of the commons? Look at privatization, regulation, and then these common property regimes. So these are all ways to help avoid this tragedy of commons issue. So we'll look at some of those and dig into some details there. All right, so this is another really important week because these concepts, we'll be referring back to them throughout the semester. Um, so as usual, I suggest you do all the readings and videos prior to class. I suggest you take a look at the question set prior to class on Wednesday, and then we'll kind of dig into I'll hit some of the highlights in class and hopefully do an in-class activity. All right. Well, if you have any questions, just reach out, but I will hopefully see all of you this week.